Hello, everyone. My name is Lori Lindley. I'm the Dean of the College of Humanities, Education, and Social Sciences at Gannon University, and I would like to welcome you to our event today. This is the second event of the Chess Speaker Series titled Racial Justice Be the Change, and we're very pleased to have a renowned and very well-regarded speaker with us today. I want to welcome our students on campus at Gannon and also the viewers on Zoom and on Facebook from across the country and around the world. So good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Chris Magno, who is the chair of the Department of Criminal Justice and Social Work, who will introduce our speaker today and also our reactors.
Good morning, everybody. I'm just gonna say magandang gabi. I think there's a lot of people from the Philippines who are participating in our lecture series today. So our speaker, Walden Bellow, is currently a professor of sociology at the State University of New York. So Walden Bellow is currently a professor of sociology at the State University of New York at Binghamton and senior research fellow at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at Kyoto University in Japan. He served as a member of the House of Representatives of the Philippines from 2009 to 2015, during which he was chairman of the Committee on Overseas Workers Affairs. He is also the author or co-authors of 20 books, including Food Wars, Dragons in Distress. And of course, his new book titled The Economic Crisis and the Development Debacle. Oh, those are the old books. I think Dr. Bellow is gonna mention those new books that you can purchase at Amazon. Our panel of reactors is Bruce Kibler, an assistant professor at the Department of Business Administration here at Gannon. He has been a full professor at the Cologne Business School in Cologne, Germany, and an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Superior. Dr. Kibler has taught many business management courses at Gannon University. Our other reactor is Dr. Richard Moody, is an assistant professor at the Department of Criminal Justice and Social Work here at Gannon. Dr. Moody is teaching several sociology and anthropology courses at Gannon for more than a decade. Without more ado, let us welcome our speaker and my former professor, Dr. Walden Bellow, and Dr. Moody and Dr. Kibler.
Good morning, my friends at Gannon. And I am joining you from Bangkok, where it is 9:13 in the evening. So good evening to those in Asia. Let me first of all thank Professor Chris Magno, Professor Moody, Dr. Lindley, Professor Kibler, and all the other organizers of this talk. And to all of those joining us from elsewhere and around the world, I would like to say that I am happy to be with all of you. So the COVID-19 pandemic is the second major crisis of globalization in a decade. The first was the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, from which the global economy took years to reach a semblance of recovery. We did not learn our lessons from the first, and this is perhaps why the impact of the second has been even more massive. Trillions of dollars of paper wealth went up in smoke during the 2008 crisis, but few cried for the out-of-control financial players who had triggered the crisis. More serious were the impacts on the real economy. Tens of millions of people lost their jobs, with 25 million in China alone in the second half of 2008. Air cargo plunged 20% in 1 year. Global supply chains, many of whose links were in China, were severely disrupted. The Economist lamented that, quote, the integration of the world economy is in retreat on almost every front, end quote. Adding that, and I quote, some critics of capitalism seem happy about it, like Walden Bellow, a Philippine economist, who can perhaps claim to have coined the word deglobalization with his book, Deglobalization Ideas for a World Economy, unquote. Well, thank you, economist, for the special plug. But contrary to the fears of the economist, and to our dismay, all were brushed aside, and after the depths of the recession in 2009, there was a return to business as usual. Though the world entered what orthodox economists called a phase of, quote, secular stagnation, unquote, or low growth with continuing high unemployment, export-oriented production via global supply chains and world trade resumed their forward march. In China, most of the $585 billion worth of stimulus earmarked for social spending by the government amidst the crisis was hijacked by the dominant export lobby, which channeled the funds to the enterprises and local governments of the eastern and southeastern coasts of the country that had become the center of a global sinocentric, quote unquote, division of labor in manufacturing industries. Carbon emissions had decelerated in the depths of the financial crisis and the follow-on recession, but they now returned to their upward trend. Air cargo traffic rebounded and air travel grew even more spectacularly. After declining by 1.2% in 2009, air travel grew annually by an average of 6.5% between 2010 and 2019. Connectivity, quote unquote, in transport, particularly air transport, was supposed to be the key to successful globalization. As the Director General of the powerful International Air Transport Association put it, quote, dampening demand for air connectivity risks high quality jobs and economic activity dependent on global mobility. Governments must understand that globalization has made our world more socially and economically prosperous. Inhibiting globalization with protectionism will see opportunities lost, unquote. Aside from the desire to speed up the flow of commodities through global supply chains, the demand for air connectivity was fueled by the desire of the global airline industry to cash in on the explosion of outbound Chinese tourism. In 2018, Chinese made 149 million overseas trips, a figure that exceeded those of other countries, including the United States. Not only the airlines, but large parts of the service sector of many countries became dependent on the massive inflow of Chinese tourists who spent over $130 billion overseas in 2018. In Thailand, the country most visited by Chinese tourists, over 11 million of whom came in 2019, tourism accounted for a whopping 20% of gross domestic product. Globalization may have recovered, but the financial crisis and the global stagnation that followed cost it dearly in terms of legitimacy, especially in the United States and Europe, where movements of the right, especially the far right, took advantage of the situation to advance economic nationalist agenda, a development we shall touch on later. China, meanwhile, took advantage of the West's retreat into economic nationalism and isolationism, in the case of President Trump, by promoting itself as the new champion of globalization. At Davos in January 2017, President Xi Jinping said that, and I quote, "The global economy is the big ocean you cannot escape from," unquote, in which China had, quote, "learned to win," unquote. He called on world political and corporate leaders to, quote, "adapt to and guide globalization, cushion its negative impacts, and deliver its benefits to all countries and all nations," unquote. More than this, President Xi offered to back up his words with a $1 trillion mega program, the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI for short, that evoked the fabled Silk routes through which trade between China and Europe was carried out in early modern times. This ambitious program consisting of dam building, road and rail construction, setting up coal plants, and extractive ventures was geared to promote what Beijing called, and I quote, "global connectivity," unquote. Originally meant to link Asia to Europe, BRI was opened to every country on earth in 2015, so that there was no longer one belt and one road, but multiple routes, including what was called a polar Silk route. While the pro-globalization clapped, others were more skeptical. Some saw the whole thing as simply a way to export the surplus capacity problem dogging Chinese heavy industry by lassoing countries with loans into massive capital-intensive projects. Focus on the Global South described the BRI as, quote, "an anachronistic transference to the 21st century of the technocratic, capitalist, state socialist, and developmentalist mindset that produced the Hoover Dam in the US, the massive construction projects in Stalin's Soviet Union, the Three Gorges Dam in China, the Narmada Dam in India, and the Namtune II Dam in Laos." These are all testaments to what Arundhati Roy has called modernity's, quote, "disease of gigantism." In 2019, despite a worsening trade war between China and the United States, there still seemed to be no alternative to globalization. Tina, there is no alternative, Margaret Thatcher's notorious law, seemed to hold. Despite rising production costs, China was chugging along, the undisputed workshop of the world, owing to greater connectivity with the rest of the world. More and more countries were buying into BRI's promise of connectivity. Air travel was booming, with corporate executives, government officials, NGO top brass brought closer together by connectivity, which also brought exponentially increasing Chinese tourists to all parts of the world, making local destinations happy and asking for more. Then the virus. Air connectivity becomes the medium for the transmission of a virus that seems to move at internet speed. The global economy grinds to a halt, not only because of lockdowns to stop the virus, but also because China's production lines stopped, exposing the folly of having supply chains based on the principle of locating them where the unit costs of production are lowest, which is the raison d'etre of globalization. The cost of subcontracting so much production to China are painfully revealed in the lack of essential medical equipment like COVID-19 test kits, syringes, even simple face masks in the United States and Europe, not to say the rest of the pandemic-stricken world. This was, of course, especially evident in the first months of the pandemic. Meanwhile, the global and regional agricultural supply chains that had put so many local farmers out of business faced disruptions as migrant workers faced COVID-19 induced barriers to travel to harvest crops, and communities halted land, sea, and air transport for fear the latter would spread the virus among them. Yet, if there's any silver lining to this tragedy, it is perhaps that it has happened today rather than later, when the BRI might well have even more fatal consequences. As Sonia Shah recently pointed out in The Nation, viruses leaping from their animal hosts to whom they bring no harm, to humans to whom they do, has become increasingly frequent because humans are invading the habitats of wildlife by cutting down forests, as well as climate change. 60% of microbial pathogens that have emerged over the last few decades come from animals, and 2/3 of this come from wildlife. The World Wildlife Federation points out that the Belt and Road Initiative will negatively impact on 1,700 diversity hotspots and about 265 species that are already at risk. Among the animals that face possible extinction or habitat destabilization from BRI are the rare Tanapuli orangutan, Sumatra tiger, Sunda pangolin, white-winged flying fox, slender-tailed cloud rat, rare civet cats, Philippine eagle, and Philippine deer. Many of these animals serve as hosts to species sleeping viruses like the novel coronavirus. What is often overlooked is what people have termed the revenge of wildlife to the disruption of their living quarters. Viruses leaping from their host to humans is one form of blowback. There are others. According to one study published in Current Biology, BRI's network of roads, railways, and pipelines could introduce more than 800 alien invasive species, including 98 amphibians, 177 reptiles, 391 birds, and 150 mammals, into several countries along its many routes and developments, destabilizing their ecosystems. As shown innumerable times, nature has a way of punishing those that disrupt living arrangements that have existed for eons. And the irony is that humans, through processes like globalization and connectivity, help facilitate this blowback. Should it continue, the blowback from BRI could well be more severe than COVID-19. But let me resume our main narrative. The 2008 financial crisis failed to put an end to globalization. Indeed, a new phase of globalization, connectivity, that we have just talked about, emerged, with China providing the political leadership and economic clout. That phase of connectivity has now ended. As countries put up barriers to the travel of people, and the transport of goods and global supply chains, through transport of goods and global supply chains are either voluntarily or de facto dismantled. The big question is what will replace globalization / connectivity as the new paradigm? Crises do not always result in significant change. It is the interaction of synergy or a synergy between two elements, an objective one, meaning a systemic crisis, and a subjective one, that is the people's psychological response to it, that is decisive. The global financial crisis of 2008 was a profound crisis of capitalism, but the subjective element, popular alienation from the system, had not yet reached a critical mass. Owing to the boom created by debt-financed consumer spending over 2 decades, people were shocked by the crisis, but they were not that alienated from the system during the crisis and its immediate aftermath. Things are different today. The level of discontent and alienation with neoliberalism was already very high in the global north before the coronavirus hit. Owing to the established elite's inability to reverse the decline of living standards and skyrocketing inequality in the dreary decade that followed the financial crisis. In the United States, the period was summed up in the popular mind as one where the elites prioritized saving the big banks over saving millions of bankrupt homeowners and ending large-scale unemployment. While in much of Europe, especially in Southern and Eastern Europe, the people's experience of the last decade was captured in one word: austerity. And in much of the global South, the chronic crisis of underdevelopment under peripheral capitalism, exacerbated by neoliberal reforms since the 1980s, had already shredded the legitimacy of key institutions of globalization, like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization, even before the 2008 crisis. The coronavirus pandemic of 2020, in short, has roared through and already destabilized global economic system, suffering from a deep crisis of legitimacy. The sense that things had run out of control, certainly out of the control of traditional political and economic managers, was the first shocking realization. The mass perception of astonishing elite incompetence is now connecting to the already deep-seated feelings of resentment and anger boiling over from the post-financial crisis period. So the subjective element, the psychological critical mass, is there. It is a whirlwind that is waiting to be captured by contending political forces. The question is, who will succeed in harnessing it? The global establishment will, of course, try to bring back the old normal, a matter to which we will later return. But there is simply too much anger, too much resentment, too much insecurity that have already been unleashed, and there's no forcing the genie back into the bottle. Though for the most part, falling short of expectations, the massive fiscal and monetary interventions of capitalist states earlier this year have underlined to people what is possible under another system with different priorities and values. Neoliberalism is dying. It's only a question of its passing, if its passing will be swift or slow, as the economist Danny Roderick of Harvard characterizes it. Only the left and the right are serious contenders in this race to bring about another system. Progressives have come up with a number of exciting ideas and paradigms developed over the last decades for how to move towards a truly systemic transformation And these go beyond the left-wing technocratic Keynesianism identified with Joseph Stiglitz and Paul Krugman. Among these truly radical alternatives are the Green New Deal, democratic socialism, degrowth, deglobalization, ecofeminism, food sovereignty, buen vivir, or living well. The problem is these strategies have not yet been translated into a critical mass on the ground. The usual explanation for this is that people are, quote, not ready for them, unquote. But probably more significant as an explanation is that most people still associate these dynamic streams of the left with the center left. On the ground where it matters, the masses cannot yet distinguish these strategies and their advocates from the Social Democrats in Europe and the Democratic Party in the United States that were implicated in the discredited neoliberal system to which they had sought to provide a, quote, progressive face, unquote. For large numbers of citizens, the face of the left is still the Social Democratic Party, SPD in Germany, the Socialist Party in France, and the Democratic Party in the United States. And their records are hardly inspiring, to say the least. In the Global South, leadership or participation in liberal democratic governments also led to left-wing parties being discredited when these coalitions adopted neoliberal measures that came under the rubric of structural adjustment. Even as the pink tide in Latin America ran into its own contradictions, and communist states in East Asia became state capitalist systems with a strong dose of neoliberalism. Once seen as a break with the past, the Concertación in Chile, the Workers' Party in Brazil, Chavismo in Venezuela, and the so-called Beijing Consensus, different though this may be, are now seen as part of that past. In short, the center-left's thoroughgoing compromise with neoliberalism in the North, along with progressive parties and states going along, if not actively adopting neoliberal measures in the South, tarnished the progressive spectrum as a whole, even though it was from the non-mainstream, non-state left that the critique of neoliberalism and globalization initially issued in the 1990s and 2000s. It is a legacy that must be decisively pushed aside if progressives are to connect with and transform into a positive, liberating force the mass anger and resentment that is now boiling over. Unfortunately, it is the extreme right that is currently best positioned to take advantage of the global discontent, because even before the pandemic, extreme right parties were already opportunistically cherry-picking elements of the anti-neoliberal stands and programs of the independent left. For instance, the critique of globalization, the expansion of the welfare state, and greater state intervention in the economy, but putting them within a right-wing gestalt. So in Europe, you had radical right parties, among them Marine Le Pen's National Front in France, the Danish People's Party, the Freedom Party in Austria, Viktor Orban's Fidesz Party in Hungary, abandoning parts of the old neoliberal programs advocating liberalization and less taxation that they had supported, and now proclaiming that they were for the welfare state and for more protection of the economy from international engagements, but exclusively for the benefit of people with the, quote, right skin color, the right culture, the right ethnic stock, the right religion. Essentially, it's the old National Socialist, class inclusivist, but racially and culturally exclusivist formula, whose consummate practitioner at present is Donald Trump. Unfortunately, this formula works among certain sectors in our troubled times, as shown by the unexpected string of electoral successes of the far right that have pirated large sectors of social democracy's working class base. Meanwhile, in the global south, charismatic leaders with cross-class appeal, like Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines and Narendra Modi in India, harness for their authoritarian projects the popular discontent with longtime liberal democratic regimes whose severely unequal social structures belied their democratic pretensions, sidelining progressive parties that had either compromised with neoliberalism, were imprisoned in classist paradigms that failed to understand the new populist realities, or were debilitated by sectarian feuds. Now, using containing the coronavirus as an excuse, these authoritarian personalities have tightened their repressive hold on the political system with extremely high levels of mass approval of their measures, though their incompetent responses to the virus have dented their popularity to some degree. But one would be foolish to count out the left. History has a complex dialectical movement, and there are often unexpected developments that open up opportunities for those bold enough to seize them, think outside the box, and are willing to ride the tiger on its unpredictable route to power, of which there are many on the left, especially among the younger generation. This brings us to the situation in the United States, which is more fluid today than it has been in years. The abominable killing of George Floyd brought a diverse movement of people to the streets under the political leadership of Black Lives Matter. What amounted to an unarmed uprising throughout the country appeared to give the broad left the momentum in the lead up to the November elections. But just as one must not count out the left, one must not count out the right. President Trump responded to the left's cry for racial justice with a blazing call for law and order to contain what he depicted as the mayhem on the streets. This was in reality a racially coded message that appealed to the white community's primordial prejudices against Black people. This counterattack culminated in Trump's speech at the Republican National Convention 2 weeks ago. I would say that despite outright falsehoods, distortions, exaggerations, and half-truths, it was delivery-wise and content-wise an effective speech. Aside from the coded racist message masquerading as a demand for law and order, its main themes were Joe Biden is a Trojan horse for socialism, Biden is weak, Biden sold the US down the river by voting for the North American Free Trade Act and China's entry to the World Trade Organization, Biden is China's man, Democrats tolerate disorder, and Democrats are anti-patriotic. The speech climaxed with a paean to the ideology of American exceptionalism, celebrating its so-called rugged individualism exemplified by its white pioneers that conquered everything and everyone in their way. Trump's speech was clearly aimed at fear-mongering middle-aged and elderly white Republican voters that had been thinking of deserting him owing to his divisiveness, incompetence, and corruption, and at firming up the white working class voters in swing states, especially in the Midwest, that had deserted the Democrats and were responsible for his win in 2016. In any event, this speech and the Republican National Convention as a whole have ensured that the 2020 election will not be a walk in the park for Democrats. Despite the Republican counterattack, I still think the odds are that the Democrats will win the election, though with only a slight edge in terms of electoral college votes. Now, what will this make of our thesis that neoliberals and globalists are a spent force, and that the future will see mainly a contention between the left and the far right? I think that especially with so many neoliberals and neoconservatives deserting Trump and the Republican Party and declaring for Biden, a Biden presidency will indeed hew politically to the center, and in terms of economic policy, seek to recharge globalization and neoliberalism, seeking specially to cater to the demands of both Silicon Valley and Wall Street. But as Marx said, history first occurs as tragedy, then as farce. My sense is that owing to the erosion of credibility of globalization and neoliberalism, the return to an anachronistic centrism will not hold and will serve at best as an extremely unstable, short-lived interregnum amidst deepening polarization between left and right. The winner of this struggle is none foreordained. Thank you.
We can have Bruce Kibler first as a reactor, and then we're gonna have Dr. Moody. Is there sound now?
Dr. Kibler, we can't hear you.
You can.
Okay. I have the pleasure of asking the first question, and it deals with, I guess, the concept of complexity theory and emergent behavior. Emergent behavior being, of course, things that 1 + 1 is not equal to 2. It can be equal to 3, 4, 11, or whatever else, right? Because when you have one person, they have their behavior, it's, a certain way. You add a second person and it can change. And the more people you add to that, of course, the more it diverges from any individual behavior and becomes something of its own. So, with that in mind, to what extent do you view this as normal, cyclical human behavior? And that includes also the pandemic as a result of normal human endeavor.
Well, good. Yes?
So you should be able to hear us. I mean, what's your questions and reaction first? Oh, you want one and then answer. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes,
Okay.
please.
My question is, I wonder if you could give us a brief definition of what you mean by neoliberalism, because that seems to be such an important generative mechanism for a whole lot of the things that are happening.
Yes, okay. Well, I would certainly I would certainly say that as elaborated by Professor Kibler, in which change takes place as a series of interactions. Nevertheless, I would say that despite at a theoretical level, interactions sort of individualizing things. Nevertheless, there is a broad movement towards a certain direction. And I would say that, in terms of the crisis of globalization that has been very much very critical since the 2008 financial crisis, and leading up to the situation of a great deal of perceived illegitimacy of the system, into which the coronavirus pandemic was introduced, that these different factors in fact have accelerated the process towards a discrediting of the paradigm of globalization, a move towards some form of deglobalization, especially when it comes to relocalizing global supply chains, and also to a discrediting of the neoliberal political center, and leading to what I think, despite the possibility of an unstable interregnum, if, for instance, the Democrats win in the United States, a greater polarization between the left and the far right. So that's the way I would respond to Professor Kibler's comments, that rather than it providing some sort of a validation for cyclical theory, I think it in fact provides more of a validation for breaks, significant qualitative breaks happening. In terms of the question of Professor Moody around neoliberalism, my sense is neoliberalism has been an approach, an ideology, a philosophy, that has downgraded the role of the state as an economic agent, the state as a regulatory agent, and has really promoted the supremacy of market forces, and pushing the state to have a minimalist role in terms of the economy. This does not mean that the state has become unimportant. In fact, as many have pointed out, state action has been very central in terms of promoting neoliberal arrangements, and eliminating, regulations that have been very important in terms of protecting people and societies from the onslaught of unregulated market forces. So that's the way that I would respond to Professor Moody's question on the definition of neoliberalism.
Trying to turn this off now. I can't. Wrong one.
Dr. Moody, you can talk now.
I like your response to my question about definition of neoliberalism. I'd like to add one thing, and perhaps this is a little bit controversial. I would see neoliberalism today as being an ideological justification for the increasing inequality, economic inequality that we have in the American population and in the population of the world at large.
Oh, definitely. I would say that, you know, that certainly is one of the consequences of the championing of privatization, deregulation, and other neoliberal measures that have taken place. I think the, you know, the centrality and the heightening of inequality is certainly, you know, part of the consequence of neoliberal policies.
So if I may, I'd like to make. So as you referred to the cyclical aspect, you referred to it more as being a break as opposed to being part of a cyclical movement. What ramifications do you foresee of this break that, you know, we are looking at for the social structure of the world, but especially of the United States?
Okay. Well, I think that, as I said, what we have seen in Europe and also increasingly in the United States, on the one hand, I think that you have the situation right now, which is, you know, a situation of tremendous inequality along class, gender, and racial lines. This is the status quo at this point, and you know, unless there is a break with neoliberalism, that is, you know, going to intensify even more, which would mean that we would have, you know, this big alliance that we've seen very evident during the COVID crisis of an alliance between Wall Street and big tech. As you know, while the rest of the economy has suffered, you know, the stock markets have been, and especially Apple and the big tech companies have been racking up profits in this during this process. So that's the status quo. In terms of the far right's proposal, as I said, you know, there is this strong populism that they have, you know, been able to generate and create, which, as I said, has taken over a number of the different themes of the left, and not only deglobalization, but also the welfare state, but put those within a right-wing gestalt, meaning that yes, these are benefits and advantages, but only for people of a certain color, of a certain culture, and that sort of class inclusivist, as I said, but racially and culturally class inclusivist and racially exclusivist kind of gestalt vision, which harks back to the 1930s. As we all know, National Socialism, national and socialist, you know, sort of that kind of class inclusivist, but racially and culturally exclusivist kind of paradigm is what is being proposed by the right. As we all know, Donald Trump's victory in 2016, which he's trying to repeat, was through an appeal to the white working class of the Midwest. And his first day in office was a very symbolic act of taking the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which had been seen as the latest stage whereby working class jobs would be lost to Asia by precisely the deindustrialized communities in the Midwest. And he was very successful in that. So this kind of populism, I think we will see more and more of that, whereby the class issues are transformed into within a right-wing context rather than in the traditional left analysis or left paradigm. With respect to the left, and I did mention this during the talk, you've had a number of visions or paradigms that have centered on promoting greater equality and greater participatory democracy, real democratic participation and real equality. Ecofeminism has promoted its version of that. Deglobalization, degrowth, which is especially sensitive to the issues of the climate, and food sovereignty, which agricultural groups have espoused. Relocalization.
Dr. Bellow?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Dr. Bellow?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
We're going to have to call an end to this. We only have a 50-minute class period.
Oh, okay.
And there'll be another class coming in here in just a few minutes. And so thank you so much for your presentation.
Okay, thank you.
We managed the technology somewhat okay, but we still have a few glitches, I'm afraid.
Okay, yes, and thank you for inviting me. And let's continue this discussion.
Walden, thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you.
Everybody for participating in this series. And we have another session on September 28th. And I hope you register and participate again. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.